Hi guys, so today I will be presenting chapter 6, which is called Ethical and Legal Issues in Psychoeducational Assessment. So what is the difference between testing and assessment? So for testing, a test is a tool that may be used to gather information, which would be part of the assessment process. Whereas an assessment is more of a broader term. Um, and according to Mauder, um, they define the assessment process as, and I quote, the planning, collection, and evaluation of pertinent to a psychoeducational concern. A psychoeducational assessment of a student, referred for individual evaluation, is conducted by a psychologist trained to gather a variety of different types of information. And these different types of information would include what we all know when we do our reports. So, health history, background, language, culture, observations that you have seen during testing, other observations that were gathered, testing results. And this is all from a number of different sources. So you would get this information from anyone that the student interacts with or works with, for example, the student themselves, the teacher, or the parents. And then you would interpret or give meaning to that information in light of the characteristics of their situation. So, school psychologists have a responsibility to seek informed, documented consent through either oral or written consent of the student's parents prior to assessment. This is for the purpose to allow the school psychologist to perform any essential and necessary psychoeducational evaluations. Um, these rules apply to minors who have a legal guardian, so, for example, a parent or an adult that is in legal guardianship of the student. A student can consent on his or her own if he or she is an emancipated minor or has reached the age to consent. In terms of the rights of parents, according to IDEA, yes, parents consent to the initial, which determines the possibility of a disability defined by the law. But just because a parent consents to an initial does not mean that they will consent to the later evaluations. For example, consent can be obtained for the initial, but if a student is found with a disability defined by law, then the parents have rights to refuse services and supports. So, excerpts from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act on evaluation procedures go as follows. A notice. The public agency must provide notice to the parents of a child with a disability in accordance with Section 300.503 that describes any evaluation processes the agency proposes to conduct. B. Conduct evaluation. In conducting the evaluation, the public agency must 1. Use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant functional, developmental, and academic information about the child, including information provided by the parent that may assist in determining whether the child is a child with a disability under Section 300.8, and the content of the child's IEP, including information related to enabling the child to be involved in and progress in the general education curriculum. 2. Not use any single procedure as the sole criterion for determining whether a child is a child with a disability and for determining an appropriate educational program for the child. And 3. Use technically sound instruments that may assess the relative contribution of cognitive and behavioral factors in addition to physical and developmental factors. Then there's C, other evaluation procedures. Each public agency must ensure that one, assessments and other evaluation materials used to assess a child under this part are selected and administered so as not to be discriminatory or on racial or cultural basis, which will be talked about later on in this presentation, are provided and administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication, which is also mentioned later on as well, are used for the purposes for which the assessment or measures are valid and reliable, are administered by a trained and knowledgeable personnel, and are administered in accordance with any instructions provided by the producer of the assessments. Two, assessments and other evaluation materials include those tailored to assess specific areas of educational need and not to merely those that are designed to provide a single general intelligence quotient. Assessments are selected and administered so as best to ensure that if an assessment is administered to a child with impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills, the assessment results accurately and reflecting the child's aptitude or achievement level. The child is assessed in all areas related to suspected disability. This includes health, vision, hearing, social, and emotional status, and so on. Assessments of children with disabilities who transfer from one public agency to another public agency in the same academic year are coordinated with those children's prior and subsequent schools. In evaluating each child with a disability under section 300.304 through 300.306, the evaluation is sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the child's special education and relative services needs, whether or not commonly linked to the disability category in which the child has been classified. And lastly, assessment tools and strategies that provide relevant information that directly assists persons in determining the educational needs of the child are provided. And other information that would also be important, according to Standards 8.4, and it's consistent with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, also is the parent granting permission for psychoeducational evaluation should be made aware of the reasons for the assessment, the type of tests and evaluation procedures used, what the assessment results will be used for, the type of records, for example, digital or paper form, and who will have access to those records. So this is the information that would have more so to do with the parents. So, school psychologists also have responsibilities towards the student. So, um, typically, as mentioned in Chapter 3, children, underage children that are tested or are going to be tested are not seen as legally competent to make autonomous decisions on their own, which is why you would need parental consent. But it is good practice and it is ethical for school psychologists to inform the student about a couple of things, such as um, the scope of the assessment and the reason for the assessment, and to explain the process of the assessment. This also helps with this building rapport and helping the student participate better during the assessment process, because it also helps build communication as well. Um, so yes, the student does have a right to be fully informed about the scope and nature of the assessment process, and whether or not the student is given the choice to assent or refuse services. Practitioners are obligated ethically to explain the assessment process to the student in a manner that, of course, the student would be able to understand, because when you're assessing a student, they could vary in age. So this explanation should include how the assessment results will be used, who will receive the information, and possible implications of the results. And this same thing applies to children and preschoolers with developmental disabilities. They should also receive an explanation in a language that they, of course, could understand. Um, in terms of why they are being seen by the school psychologist and why are they there in the first place. So there are three phases of assessment planning, which include assessment planning, information gathering, and interpretation of findings, which require database decision making and professional judgment. School psychologists are obligated to make decisions that promote the welfare of the student in each phase of the assessment process and to accept responsibility for the decisions made. So, so there are five ethical legal concerns. These include multifaceted, comprehensive, fair, valid, and useful. So for the first one, which is multifaceted, um, psychoeducational assessment of a child with learning or behavior problems must be based on information gathered from multiple measures and multiple informants. For comprehensive, children with suspected disabilities must be assessed in all areas related to the suspected disability, including, if appropriate, health, vision, hearing, social and emotional status, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative, and motor abilities. For FAIR, school psychologists strive to conduct fair and valid assessments. And this also is connected to English language learners. So, assessment tools used in the evaluation of children with suspected disabilities are provided and administered in the child's native language, so the language that they use at home or in a common environment that they usually speak in, or other mode of communication, and in the form most likely to yield the most accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, unless it's not feasible to do so. Um, Another thing I want to mention is in terms of children with disabilities, according to Part B, sorry, Part B. Part B also mandates careful selection of assessment procedures for children with sensory, motor, or speech impairments. Children with deafness or blindness or no written language must be evaluated using the mode of communication that he or she uses. An example would be sign language. Furthermore, assessments are selected and administered so as best to ensure that if an assessment is administered to a child with an impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills, the assessment results accurately reflect that child's aptitude or achievement level, or whatever other factors the test purposes to measure, rather than reflecting the child's impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills. So this would also provide the most accuracy and would show less bias towards whatever their disability might be in terms of sensory, manual, or speaking skills, which is out of their would be out of their control if they're using sign language or something like that. For children from diverse cultural, ethnic, and racial backgrounds, Code of Ethics, professional standards, and special education law also mandate discriminatory assessment of children from diverse cultural, ethnic, and racial backgrounds, as this issue of non discriminatory assessment is complex and it will be mentioned in a little more detail later on in the presentation. So moving on, another concern is validity. So school psychologists use assessment techniques and practices that a profession considers to be responsible and research-based. They select assessment instruments and strategies that are reliable and valid for the child and the purpose of the assessment. And this falls under 300.304. Also, usefulness. So, school psychologists use their expertise in assessment for the purpose of improving the quality of life for the child. So, that would be the entire purpose of doing the assessment in the first place. So, those would be the five concerns, the ethical, legal concerns that were discussed in this chapter. School psychologists try to stick with a successive levels model, which means that school psychologists use the most reliable and valid sources and pieces of information during the decision making process. An example of what is considered is the students' composite scores on technically adequate measures. However, school psychologists can also look at more subjective elements such as observations, performance on subtests, and impressions as a way to gather information on the student's overall profile. According to the standards, school psychologists must understand that the validity of the interpretation for intended uses of scores. They should also understand the reliability and precision of the scores and the applicability of the normative data available in the test manual, and they should also understand the potential positive and negative consequences. So, in terms of reliability, reliability would mean the consistency of test scores across testing procedures. And two types include testability, which is where a student shows consistency of scores from one testing session to another. This is also known as test retest. Usually, internal consistency is seen as adequate when it's between 0.60 to 0.65. Usually 0.90 and more or above is seen as more desirable. Internal consistency coefficients, which are scores, their scores obtained during one administration of the test. So that's the second type of reliability. And then there is validity, which was mentioned a little bit earlier. So validity equals the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores for proposed uses of tests. So in terms of validity, test producers gather validity evidence from a variety of sources, including evidence based on test content, response processes, internal structure, relations to other variables, and validity and consequences of testing. Test norms provide norm reference scores, which allow school psychologists to interpret a student's test performance in comparison to a reference group of the same age, grade, or disability. Test norms must be based on a sample representative of the intended target population of the test, recent, and it also must be appropriate, obviously, for the student being evaluated. So, for information gathering, there are three things that school psychologists must consider when gathering information. And these three things include invasion of privacy. So the school psychologist must be mindful and respectful of the student and his or her family's privacy. The school psychologist gathers enough information that can demonstrate a picture of the student in a comprehensive manner that would be used during the decision making and planning process without going into such detail into or unwanted detail into the family. The second thing is assessment conditions. So evaluations must be in the best interest of the student with a suitable environment and must be standardized. And then the third thing is test security. So, inappropriate release of information reduces the validity of the test, so you should not just go around throwing students' assessments everywhere. So, that would be very, very wrong. School psychologists are obligated to maintain the integrity and sec- security of test materials. Okay, so in terms of assessment interpretation, school psychologists have an ethical duty to inform any concerns that they might have in terms of validity, reliability, because these concerns could have an impact on whether or not the child gets services, um, and they are obligated to ensure that the results are actually useful because you don't want to waste resources and the student's time and the parent's time and the teacher's time and your own time. And then you also want to make sure there is sufficient data for appropriate recommendations. So you want to make sure you have collected enough information and have done enough assessments and well testing and have enough information from other sources of individuals like teachers and um, parents and everything to back up your recommendations, and also to be aware of different classifications. So, in different schools, different school psychologists might use different types of classifications for students. Um, for example, some people might base a lot of their classifications on the DSM 5, whereas others don't. So, it's always important to be aware of these different classifications so you're not walking into a situation where everyone else is confused about what you are doing because the previous school psychologist did things completely differently. So, for report writing and sharing findings, one thing that's important is to always be cautious about the types of information you include or choose to include um, in a report because sometimes it could be used in a legal court case because it serves as documentation for legal proceedings as well as other things such as it's a communication tool for referrals. It's also used to help in special education decision making and identifying instructional needs. So now I'm going to talk about non-discriminatory assessment, which is mostly about the history of testing and ability tests. So it's important for school psychologists to familiarize themselves with how testing was done in the past 100 years or more. And the reason why is because of a lot of the consequences that occurred due to testing and how testing was done in the past on different cultures and different races and different sexes. An example would be the 1916 Stanford Binet Intelligence Scales and the development group um, of ability tests. IQ tests were used to characterize black persons as members of a genetically inferior race and to justify discriminatory treatment in society, to characterize non Anglo immigrants as intellectually inferior and therefore undesirable. And the tests also ended up supporting laws which allow sterilization of women of below normal IQ without their consent. And the reason why it's important for school psychologists to familiarize themselves with the history of IQ testing and ability tests is because some parents they may feel uncomfortable if their child is being tested based off of what they've heard about tests and how tests were done in the past towards different cultures. And certain parents may be of that culture, so that's probably why they would feel uncomfortable. And so it's important for school psychologists, in order to get the most accurate information, to familiarize themselves with these different tests and not show bias, which I'll also be talking about. So, and another thing I want to mention is IDEA stated that selective and administered so as not to be discriminatory on ra- uh, racial or cultural bias, which is part of what we do in testing now. So we try to avoid having bias and cultural discrimination. Another thing I'm going to talk about is culture and acculturation. So, acculturation is a process of social, psychological, and cultural change that stems from the balancing of two cultures while adapting to the prevailing culture of society. Acculturation is a process in which an individual kind of adapts and acquires and adjusts to a new cultural environment. One thing that I should mention is there's also something called acculturation stress, which is the stress of adapting to two or more cultures, which should be considered in mental health evaluations of a student when you're assessing a student. Then there's also test bias. So, what is test bias? Test bias refers to the psychometric adequacy of the instrument, which means the evidence that a test or procedure is not equally valid when used with children from differing ethnic or cultural backgrounds. And then there's also clinical application. So there could be bias in clinical application. So bias in clinical application refers to fairness in administration, interpretation, and decision making. The use of bias tests may lead to unfair decisions, which is what you're trying to avoid. You want to be the most fair. So there's fairness of consequences. A third area of concern is fairness of consequences of test use. This involves the appraisal of the outcomes or consequences of test use for a particular group. If testing and assessment practices result in children from a particular ethnic group being placed in inferior educational programs, the outcomes or consequences of testing are biased and unfair. So, personality assessments. Personality tests have been a special focus of concern only because questions on personality tests, they are often indirect, and the test taker may unknowingly reveal aspects of their self, including emotional problems, that he or she is not really prepared to unveil or say or talk about. So there are two strategies that can be used in order to safeguard privacy and the use of personality tests. So the first thing would be is to make sure you get consent from the individual, from the student or the guardian. And then the second thing would be for the school psychologist to consider carefully if they are justified in assessing the student, which would be the school psychologist must weigh the risk of intrusion on the student and family privacy against the likelihood that such techniques will result in information that would be helpful in promoting the student's overall welfare. So just trying to make sure to weigh out the risk factor versus what would work best for the students. Um, and with that, there are three ethical areas of concern related to personality assessments. So, one is unwarranted invasion of privacy. The second is meeting professional and legal standards for demonstrated test validity. And lastly, school psychologists may not be adequately trained for specific tests, so you want to make sure that whoever is doing the test is actually trained and has knowledge and understanding of the purpose and the way the test is supposed to be administered. So, for professional competence and autonomy, for competence, ethically, school psychologists must be competent in conducting psychoeducational assessments and evaluations. Anytime a practitioner decides to shift their services, they must receive training in the new area that they decided to shift their services in. Practitioners are advised to develop a team of colleagues, but they have to make sure that everyone has sufficient training and expertise in doing psychoeducational assessments. So, professional autonomy, idea part B requires the consideration of certain types of information in the evaluation of children with suspected disabilities. For example, intellectual ability, achievement, adaptive behavior, and developmental history all must be considered in the evaluation of children who may be eligible within IDEA classification of intellectual disability. So, state laws and local district policies may specify additional types of information to be considered in the evaluation of children with suspected disabilities. So, it's the school psychologist's responsibility to have knowledge about what these requirements may be depending on where they are working. Um, to serve the best interests of students, school psychologists must insist on professional autonomy in the selection of specific assessment instruments. District mandated test batteries are inconsistent with professional standards and may result in unsound assessment choices for a student being evaluated, and this would result in violating the intent of special education law that requires tests to be selected in the light of the unique characteristics of the individual child. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about is computer assisted psychoeducational assessment. So, school psychologists should understand the benefits of computerized assessment. Can make things a lot more tidy and quick to set up. Examinees might be more candid during computerized testing. They might feel more comfortable, especially if you're working with younger kids who are used to using a lot of tablets and touchscreen at school to do work. They may feel more comfortable using a computer to do the assessments. Um, so it's also less likely to produce scoring errors, and also provides interpretative guidance for the school psychologist. It also allows the school psychologist to focus during the administration on the individual and make certain observations that they probably would have missed if they weren't doing a computerized version of the assessment. And another thing is it's actually pretty cost effective too, compared to using the regular traditional form of assessments with the booklets and the paper and pen and the stimulus books. So altogether, it's a bit more cost effective than what is mostly used across the states. So these are just a couple of things about the how computers can benefit school psychologists when they do testing.